So we have the red zone and the blue zone. Blue zone is about mission, about the mission of the organization, and the focus is always on the mission and the vision, where we're going. As the conversation and the conflict develops around those particular issues, then the conflict can go on for quite a while, actually. As it, though, starts to turn personal and become red zone, in fact, two ways, let me give you that right now, two ways you can understand when a person or a conflict within an organization has gone red zone. Two things happen. First of all, the discussion's too intense. Now, a blue zone discussion doesn't mean it doesn't have an emotion in it. By the way, it does. But emotion is always trumped by reason. Red zone, on the other hand, reason is trumped by emotion. So the emotion seems out of proportion. Let's say we're arguing about the color of the carpet, in the nursery. Okay, and somebody is completely out of control about it. You think, wait a minute, this conflict does not warrant this kind of response. That should alert you. The other best way to understand that it's probably, not always, but usually red zone is when the conflict goes on and on and on, and what seems to be something that should be resolved, such as allocation, I was saying about youth and older people, just goes on and on and on and on and cannot get resolved. It's usually red zone. Because when you think about it, red zone conflict cannot be resolved. If I'm arguing with you about myself, how are you going to resolve that for me? You can't. Especially if I'm not even acknowledging that it's about me, but I'm still arguing that I really want the older folks to get the resources here, and I'm arguing and arguing and arguing, digging my heels in, and let's say you have a policy of unanimity on your vestry, so now I've really dug my heels in and nothing's going to move in any direction whatsoever on this vestry until, by golly, I get my way. That's going to be a red zone situation. And by the way, be advised that people always, and it goes back to the Garden of Eden, people always default to self-interest. But as they default to self-interest, they also slide into the red zone. When you are sitting on a nonprofit board, such as a vestry, self-interest needs to be very closely monitored. Because, again, my focus needs to be on the mission of the organization, not what's in my best interest. So here I am 65 years old and saying, by golly, we've got to have more resources for the older people. No, when I'm on the board, I should be defaulting to the mission of the organization. What's in this organization's best interest, not what's in my personal best interest. However, that gets constantly confused for people. And in some ways, if you want to look at it that way, it can be the basis of the fall. That people were constantly defaulting to self-interest as opposed to God's interest. Okay, so that's how that works. And it works constantly, and it's constantly in play for all of us. Now remember what I said though, and that is that red zone does not have very good markers. In fact, in some ways, it doesn't have any markers. And until we started thinking about this a number of years ago ourselves in my consulting world, I'd never heard anybody talk about it. They talk about managing conflict and the evil people in your congregation and all this kind of thing, but didn't really talk about managing yourself and being the non-anxious presence in these kinds of situations to help move people from a bad place to a much better place. That's what we're talking about here. So, let's talk about now your own personal red zone and what I think, and by the way, this isn't gospel, so don't take this as the truth, but I have found then I think there's 4 prominent red zone themes, because I've seen it, and it comes up in various forms in various places, by the way, not talking about conflict, but just talking about psychological themes and whatnot that seem to be fairly prominent there. And here's what I believe about this, okay? And again, I want you to use this more as theory than as fact, but I think it is a useful theory. And that is, I'm going to give you 4 themes, and they're here in your notes. But I think that each of us has a signature theme. In other words, all of us can default to all of these at one time or another. But I'll tell you about myself and how that works in my life, and then I want you to think about how it works in your life. In other words, as you start to go red zone, I really think one of these themes is going to bubble up, maybe 2 or 3, but one of them is going to be much more prominent. The first of which is what I call survival, okay? In other words, here's my story. Remember, my story now is bubbling up into the conflict. I'm no longer focusing on the mission. I'm starting to focus on my own story, and the first theme is survival. Now, the reason I say survival is because often people, almost invariably, people who have this particular theme come from the most chaotic backgrounds. They grew up in possibly alcoholic families, or they grew up in foster homes where they're moved around a lot, but there was a lot of inconsistency in the parenting they received. Now, remember what I said about in the last lecture, that trust is the first developmental stage that you've got to get. Well, that's all well and good, but what about if your principal and primary caregivers are not trustworthy? All of a sudden, trust becomes a major issue in your life. And the people who are the closest to you are the most dangerous, which means I need to keep people at an arm's distance, because as they get closer to me, they become more dangerous, which is totally counterintuitive, as you know. Like in marriage, we talk about couples getting closer together and bonding together and whatnot. What I find with survival people is as they start getting closer to their spouse, they'll initiate a fight or they'll do something to get distance because their smoke detector goes off. It says there's a fire. There really isn't, but the fire is the closeness itself. So a survival person, this theme will begin to rise up in them as they start to go red zone. And the story that is in the back of their brain is closeness is dangerous. Now, with each of these, by the way, there's a good side to it and a bad side. The good side, these people, by the way, the survival people, tend to be incredibly street smart. They are so good at pointing out incongruity you wouldn't believe. They sense immediately when somebody's incongruent. Why? Because these people learned early on to spot trouble, because it was critical to their survival. So if a parent was drunk and out of control, they noticed immediately that's what was going on, and then they would start pulling back from the situation very quickly. That's the way this works. And then, remember, we're talking about red zone here, so I'm in conflict, and we're talking about the youth group and the older people and resource allocation. But if I think survival's on the line, I will then go into very protective mode in many, many ways in that discussion. I'm no longer talking about the mission of the church. I'm starting to talk about Jim Osterhaus. So survival is the first. The second one that we talk about, and this one is mine now, what I'm going to talk about, and that's acceptance. Acceptance is a theme that says that I must be acceptable, and that if people reject me or are upset with me in any particular way, I'm in trouble. Now that comes, I had a wonderful mother, but she also taught us about very, very much so, and for those of you who are PKs in particular, you're probably really taught this, and that is what other people think of you is very, very important. It's a reflection on our family. My mother and father weren't pastors, but I still got a lot of that. monitoring what other people thought, being acceptable in my behavior. Now, it has a good side in this regard. I think it really made me very empathetic toward other people, very good at connecting with other people in ways. The negative part of it is I become a people pleaser. In other words, if I'm not careful, I'll do whatever it takes to make people like me. And you know what? When, especially those of you in ministry, when you're needing to say the hard things to people, and I found this in my counseling world, sometimes I had to say some very hard things to people that I thought had started down a path that was incredibly dangerous to them. Well, I can't be liked. In fact, in telling them the truth, they may do like the rich young ruler. They may pivot and walk away because I said, well, if you want to follow, all you need to do is sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come along. Well, that guy rejected Jesus. Acceptance people have a lot of trouble with that. So it's something I, all my life, have had to monitor, such as taking things back to the store is very difficult for me. So if I have a faulty product and I need to take it back to the store, see, I start worrying about whether the clerk will accept me or not. So seriously, but that's again, it's a non-reason mediated, that's what makes it red zone, remember? It's emotional, it's not reasonable. But I have to get the argument into the reasonable part of my brain, the blue zone part. So what I do is sit down, and I will, I don't do it so much anymore, but I'd sit down and coach myself with, the clerk doesn't own the store, whether I bring the product back or not is irrelevant, and if they don't like me, that doesn't matter either. The product doesn't work, and they need to take this product back. So I would actually go through that, because what I'm doing in that is getting the signal out of the emotional part of my brain into the frontal lobes of my brain, where I can think about it as an adult, not as a 6-year-old. So acceptance is the second one. Survival, number one. Number two is acceptance. Number three is this thing what we call competence. These are the folks that really, really look to competence and to monitor whether or not they are competent. Tend to be extremely high achievers, by the way. Go to all the best universities, build huge resumes. The one problem that I find with competence people, often being loved is linked to being competent. So there is that sense of I must do an exemplary job in everything that I do, and if I don't, I'm in deep trouble. Unfortunately, these folks tend not to have thermostats, internal thermostats that are in place. Remember what a thermostat does. A thermostat, when you set the temperature in your room at 72, when your furnace reaches the 72 mark, it turns the furnace off. That's what a thermostat does. If you don't have one, the furnace continues to pour out heat. And what I've seen with a lot of competence people is they have resumes that won't quit. They have double PhDs. I live in an area where you have a lot of these people that work in the federal government and whatnot. They're very high ranking in the federal government. And I mean, you wouldn't believe their resumes. And everybody really admires their resume except one person, themselves. Nothing is enough. So they continue to achieve and achieve and achieve with this gnawing sense of it ain't enough. So the good, remember there's good and bad for both of for all of these. The good with this is these people are extremely competent, obviously. They do marvelous things. The bad of it is they always have this gnawing sensation that it's not enough. And if they're not careful, they become perfectionists, constantly seeking the perfect. They don't have any sense at all of what's good enough and when they should stop. Then the last one is this one we call control. Control is a person who, well, needs to be in control, and you see that a lot. Power and control is very, very important to them. Often these people have a lot of trouble following. They really need to be in control of situations because there is an anxiety and a vulnerability internally in their story that says, if I'm not in control of the situation, I am very vulnerable. And I'm very, very vulnerable to bad things happening to me. So on the good side of that, these people often are in leadership positions and sometimes are very, very effective. It isn't like they're not effective as leaders. But the trouble is they can become very, very over-controlling and very walled off from other people and very poor followers often if they don't understand that this is a central red zone issue for them. So in each of these, survival, acceptance, competence, and control, they have a very good aspect to them, but left to their own devices, they can be very, very destructive. Again, remember, this is fire we're talking about here. Fire heats your house, fire burns your house down. And remember also what we're talking about is self-awareness. If you're not aware of these themes, these red zone themes will bubble up, and you think you're talking about resource allocation, all of a sudden you're talking about your survival, whether you're accepted as a person, whether you don't think I'm competent now because you've rejected my argument, or you're trying to control me, that becomes a problem. And by the way, let me say this, and that is, you can have all of them, but like I have I like to be competent. Like with these talks I'm doing with you right now, I want them to be very, very competent, but to me, it's in the service of acceptance. See, as I feel like I'm more competent, that you'll be more accepting of me. So a lot of times you'll have 2 or 3 of these themes, but that's where I'm always thinking, what is your signature theme that bubbles up for you?